Hi, and welcome again to the lecture series on sustainability marketing. And with me here I have Professor K12E03, who will answer my question on the final chapter of Reframing Sustainability Marketing. So I have a few questions still, maybe to put this whole matter to rest. And my first question is to do with the differences between conventional marketing and sustainability marketing. As I have known, conventional marketing has some pretty distinct boundaries and they're pretty measurable. And I was wondering if the same does actually go with sustainability marketing.
No, I think that's one of the real differences with sustainability marketing is, in many ways, it's a much more open systems approach to understanding the business, the consumer, the market and the society that marketers operate within. So in that way, it's much more complex, actually, because you're trying to appreciate the implications of the consumption and production system that you're part of, both further out into society, further back down the supply chain, and also into the future. So, you're right, it's a much more complex approach to marketing. I'd say in some ways it is much more realistic from that point of view. I think some of the boundaries that are drawn conventionally between, say, this is marketing and this is strategy, for example, in terms of strategic management, are often very artificial. And so I think it's quite important for companies to think holistically. And it's almost back to Peter Drucker's very classic notion that marketing is the whole business seen from the point of view of the consumer. So I think really it's very helpful for marketers, I think, to have that more open system, that more holistic view of the market and the commercial activity that they're part of. So I think, yes, you're right, it does make it much more complicated, but I'd say also more interesting and more realistic from that point of view.
Okay, and in this chapter you've spoken a lot on social enterprises. You've described them as enterprises run by people who are driven by a motive to pretty much better the world. They're not seeking for profit. They are more determined to improve the conditions rather than anything else. And I was wondering that, with this kind of approach where you're not really making money, does this not compromise the ability then to provide sustainable quality-wise? So,
yeah, that's a really interesting question. And actually there's real debate in the literature about social enterprise as an approach to business. Is it actually a more or less robust model than the conventional business model? I think you can look at it in two ways. I mean, the one way is, if you don't have to make a profit, if all you have to do is break even, in some ways that makes it easier for you as a business because you don't have the pressure, if you like, of generating a profit, keeping your shareholders happy from that point of view. So it does mean that social enterprise is a very effective approach to business in relatively poor communities where it's perhaps difficult to deliver benefits to people and make a profit out of it as well. And we're seeing, in Latin America, the social enterprise model has become very widely used in communities, often for things like community banks, so providing financial services in communities where really conventional banks won't bother because they can't make a profit. And also healthcare provision, providing healthcare to poor communities, again, where commercial providers couldn't make a profit and where governments don't have the money to provide healthcare. We're seeing social enterprises fill that gap. So yeah, there's one argument that it's kind of a more robust model. And also taking away that shareholder pressure, I think, is important because if you look in the commercial, conventional commercial businesses, very often it's shareholder pressure that holds them back from being more sustainable. I think it's quite notable that among the businesses that are often leaders amongst big companies, it's quite often those that are privately held, that have a large sort of family shareholding, for example, or privately held, or are cooperatives, social enterprises. So, SC Johnson, for example, been a real leader for sustainable solutions in personal care products and cleaning products, but it's still a family firm, and it can afford, and it's actually said it can take risks that its competitors can't because it doesn't have shareholders that it has to respond to and meet their needs. So I think maybe that absence of the need for profit, the shareholder pressure does help social enterprises to be innovative, more sustainable in what they do, serve those communities that maybe need serving in particular. On the other hand, you can look in practice and there are a lot of social enterprises that are kind of just struggling to get by and that maybe do need support. But it isn't always direct financial support. Often these businesses don't have the sort of business advice, the business skills that they need to really thrive. And I think we're starting to see really more of a support network being developed, even down to courses on social enterprise within universities. Is a reasonably new innovation. We're only just seeing that come through. I think the problem, perhaps, with the lack of profit for social enterprise as a type of business delivering sustainability marketing solutions is they often can't scale up. Often they can serve a local community and they do it really well and often in quite innovative ways, but without that extra money, they find it quite hard to then expand that business beyond that local community. So I think that's maybe where the social enterprise model has difficulties, is that going beyond serving one particular community to become a more widely used business model and type of solution. And I think people are starting to look at ways of doing that. It's social enterprise really as a field of research and scholarship is quite new. Well, not exactly new, but it's taken a while to develop. But recently there's been a real expansion in our understanding and our knowledge about them. And I think we're going to see that social enterprise agenda and the sustainability agenda really coming together in both thinking and practice over the next few years.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what social enterprises are achieving. But then my main concern is this really information that is readily available to the day-to-day consumer? Because I think sometimes as much as they do so much work, as much as they help communities, sometimes you just need to get the word out there, so that the other consumers can learn from it and know about this kind of thing. And this, of course, it involves some kind of intensive promotion of social enterprises. And at the end of the day, you ask yourself, we know promotion can be quite costly. If they're not making a profit, which is good, how then do they go about promoting this whole concept of sustainability through social enterprises?
Yes, I think some of the social enterprises do tend to operate sometimes in markets that are almost a bit invisible. So there are quite a lot involved in, for example, waste management and environmental protection, which are things that consumers don't necessarily see. There's also a growing number worldwide in terms of tourism. But again, it's not necessarily obvious to the consumer that when they stay at a particular tourist resort, if it's run as a social enterprise, the consumer doesn't necessarily know about it. So I think the idea of promoting social enterprise as a business model does have a way to go, both generically and for individual social enterprises. I think the cooperative movement, which is one aspect of social enterprise, has been quite successful in terms of pushing the cooperative model. So in the UK, you have The Cooperative as one of the major retailers who've really taken a lead in terms of sustainability, in terms of ethical sourcing, in terms of introducing sustainability-orientated products, and in fact ethical financial services they've taken a lead in as well. I think the other part of social enterprise that has really, if you like, caught the public imagination is fair trade. Because fair trade, again, it's a commercial business, and yes, it generates profit, but really, the mission of fair trade organisations is to improve the livelihoods of the producer communities by making sure that when we buy our coffee, when we buy our chocolate, if it's fair trade, more of the money goes back to those communities, often in poorer countries, who need the fair price paid for the goods that they produce. So I think fair trade is a real success story in terms of it's a form of social enterprise. We've seen tremendous growth over the last 10 years or so, and it's something that consumers really like and really identify with and have been willing to embrace. But I think you're right. It's still early days, I think, for many types of social enterprise in terms of generating that awareness of what they do, what the benefits of being a social enterprise are, and why that's maybe potentially a good model for business from a sustainability point of view.
Okay, and I remember now you spoke about maybe the market moving more to a blending approach. You blend your commercial activities with sustainability ones. I even remember in the previous lecture speaking to Professor Frank Martin Belt, and he was talking about how now you have even the bigger brands sensitizing the customers themselves, about sustainability marketing. It's not so much a separate entity anymore. It's combined into one organization. And I was wondering, for a company that is probably gained a name in a conventional traditional marketing, commercial marketing, and when they try to implement now sustainability marketing concepts, wouldn't this somehow provide a vast difference in their marketing strategies? And how do they go about this?
Yes, I think it can be a challenge for some companies, and partly it probably depends on what sort of market you're in. I think if you're a food company, for example, I think a lot of the things you might do in terms of developing more sustainable food solutions, of maybe lowering the food miles, reducing the level of pesticides or chemical fertilizer that goes into a product, moving maybe towards organic products, moving towards more local products being available in particular areas. I think those are all things that are pretty much in tune with what we know consumers like anyway. So I think it doesn't really create any problem, I think, for companies in those kind of markets to bring the sustainability elements of their business very strongly into the way in which they market themselves to consumers. Other companies is maybe trickier. So I think if you're in the car industry, for example, although all car manufacturers are trying to find ways of delivering cars that are less environmentally damaging, being lower emissions, more fuel efficient. I think the idea of a sustainable car still doesn't seem very natural, I think, to consumers. So I think for a car company to really push itself as a sustainability orientated company is always difficult, because I think they're always open to criticism about the damage that cars do, and how really sustainable can a car be. So I think for those kind of companies, it is more of a challenge to really bring, and I think a lot of these companies have very sincere ambitions to make their business more sustainable, but at the same time they do face constraints almost of the market they're operating in, and as I've said before, constraints from what, for example, shareholders will accept, and even what customers will accept in terms of how radical a change of products their customers are willing to accept. So sometimes it's a question of kind of just moving gently forward, bringing the customer, shareholders, other stakeholders along with you. I think the thing also companies maybe face is that it's the step from sustainability being part of the business to sustainability being the core of the business. And I think that's often where the challenge comes, because a lot of companies, long-established companies who have a long history and expertise in conventional approaches to business and to marketing, maybe begin by having one part of the business thinking in terms of sustainability. So perhaps one product line that they target at a certain group of customers, but it's just seen as one part of the business. And I think really to then say, well, okay, we're not just going to make it about some of our products, about some of our consumers. We're going to make it about the business as a whole. I think that's really quite a daunting challenge. But we've seen companies do it, and I think companies like Marks and Spencer through their Plan A, Unilever through their Sustainable Living Plan, have really taken a look at the whole company and said, okay, well, can we make the whole company more sustainable in terms of the way it operates, what it offers to consumers, and really be quite unashamed about that really is the way we're going to run the whole business. And so far, I think consumers have responded very well to that. They don't see any great problem in companies making that step. But I think it's important to recognise that for some companies it's going to be easier than others, and for some companies it'll take longer, I think, to make a journey towards being significantly more sustainable.
All right. And in your last lecture, last two episodes actually, you talked about the timeline. You even had a slide on it, and you showed how basically the marketplace has evolved, from less sustainable ways, naturally more so, and moved more towards behaving in a more sustainable way. And with this in mind, I would say we are actually heading to perhaps a more sustainable approach, but still I see there's still need for sustainability marketing. Is it maybe a huge urgency to speed up this process?
Well, I think we can say there's lots of things that are going in the right direction. So even down to, if you look at the slide that I showed earlier on in lecture 8 about an increased number of consumers interested in sustainability products. We're seeing more sustainability orientated products on the market. In some of those core markets, we're seeing a growth in terms of eco homes, passively heated homes. In cars, we're seeing rapid growth in alternatively fueled vehicles, low emission vehicles, or we're seeing growth in bicycle sales in many countries. We're seeing more organic and locally sourced and more environmentally efficiently grown and distributed food stuff. So there's lots of good stuff going on there. And you can say from the point of view of waste regulations, we're seeing recycling rates going up around Europe and in other countries as well, and more product being recycled and more value being sort of retained within the production and consumption system. So I think on the one hand, yes, there's lots of good stuff going on. And it's important to recognise that, and where it's happened, applaud it, and hopefully keep it going in future. But I think if you were to say, are we actually fundamentally any more sustainable as a society now than we were, say, 25 years ago, when the Brundtland report first, rang the alarm bells fairly widely? I think you've got to say, well, not really. The key things, our homes aren't really very different to the way they were 25 years ago. We haven't really changed the way in which we consume food. Our diets and lifestyles in relation to food are much the same, and in fact there's been a growth in sort of prepackaged convenience foods, for example, which many argue is a less sustainable approach to foods. There's been tremendous growth in air travel, for example, which we know is relatively environmentally damaging. So the problem is, I think most of the key environmental indicators are still going in the wrong direction. Quite a lot of the social sort of indicators, sort of things set out in the Millennium Development Goals, many are improving, but not necessarily fast enough. And I think you can almost think of it as an analogy to the situation we have in a lot of economies in Europe, in North America, and some other countries as well, in terms of like deficit reduction, in terms of the public debt. That a lot of countries are implementing deficit reduction measures to try and improve the sort of debt crisis within those countries. A lot of those measures haven't really made things better, but they have kind of stopped things getting worse. And I think the steps that we've often taken towards a more sustainable economy, both in terms of regulation and in terms of what companies are doing, have improved things in terms of stopping them getting worse, but they haven't really taken us back towards a more sustainable way of living and producing and consuming. So I think there is still that next step change we need to make beyond things just not getting any worse to actually starting to make things get better again. And I think if you look at the urgency of climate change, for example, we're really getting towards, the scientific data tells us we're really getting very close to the edge that 2 or 3 degrees global climate change will become unavoidable, even if we really cleaned up things very quickly. So we're getting towards that crisis point where I think we're going to have to make some very significant changes to get towards an improvement, or even just to stay where we are and stop things getting worse. So I think really the urgency of having more sustainable societies, economies, more sustainable marketing, really is growing, even though, yes, there are many good things happening.
Okay, I think this brings us to a very interesting aspect of transformation. You've mentioned that it is quite a challenging aspect of sustainability marketing, but I really wanted to know from your personal point of view, how do you think we can what are the potential ways of maybe implementing transformation?
Yeah, transformation really is the kind of $64,000 question. How do we transform?
Yeah.
And actually people aren't necessarily very good at transforming anything. We tend to be quite conservative. We tend to quite like evolutionary change. We tend to kind of quite like our lives to be quite like they were before. So I think how do you achieve transformation is the big question. I mean, there is one simple answer, actually, which is that we could incorporate the social and environmental damage that's done by our production and consumption systems in the price that we pay for goods and services. There's a simple kind of one-step market solution. If the prices we paid for things actually did reflect the environmental and social damage they do and covered those costs, we would very rapidly move towards a much more sustainable economy and society. Now, it would be a pretty traumatic transformation for many societies, but we have started to see debates about things like a European carbon tax. And do we start to actually incorporate the cost of carbon emissions that are in goods and services, in the prices that we pay for them through taxation? Now, politically, socially, it's very controversial. But I think it was J.K. Galbraith, the economist, who actually said that politics is the art of choosing between the unpalatable and the disastrous. And I think that's kind of the situation we are at the moment, that although almost voluntarily transforming our economy and our society might be pretty unpalatable. If we don't, we're going to be faced with a transformation that will be disastrous. I think you also can see some examples where some kind of traumatic social or environmental event does create some sense of transformation. I was very sort of taken by what happened in Japan in the wake of the 2011 earthquake and the tsunami and the disaster at the Fukushima nuclear power plant, which was it actually had a really profound social impact in Japan that in terms of social attitudes that are kind of monitored through surveys annually there, found that after the disaster, there was a significant change in Japanese citizens, sort of their values, their concerns. They started to become much less interested in sort of earning money and consuming material goods, suddenly much more orientated back towards family, back towards relationships, back to issues of quality of life. They became much more interested in becoming more self-sufficient in terms of things like energy production, for example. So it's quite interesting how a traumatic event like that did really have an effect on a nation's psyche in terms of making them much more willing, I think, to embrace a more sustainable way of life. Now, in a sense, maybe in a year or two that will pass and they'll go back to the kind of values and aspirations that they had before. But it does show that sometimes things can make us more open to significant change and towards a more transformative approach to our economy.
I hope we don't need a catastrophe to get a wake-up call on
in some ways that's what you would hope, and I think that's it. It's the question of transforming in a voluntary and a kind of smart and a sort of proactive way now, or kind of hanging on, doing what we're doing and waiting for disaster to strike. And it's again a bit what happened in the financial markets in 2008. And people have been saying that, particularly the American subprime mortgage market, but also financial markets across the world, were dealing with levels of debt that were unsustainable. Eventually a crash would come, and yet somehow we couldn't quite stop things and change things early enough to prevent the crunch coming. And I think it's a question of really thinking about, well, can we find ways of avoiding the energy crunch? Because we know that 20th century wealth was largely based on cheap oil, and the cheap and easily available oil, as Frank explored in Chapter 3, is running out. I mean, yes, there'll still be oil there, but not the cheap and easy oil that we enjoyed in the 20th century. And so we know, really, the lifestyles and production and consumption systems that we've had can't be maintained into the future. So, we really will have to find new ways of doing things. So I think, for me, it's better to kind of change sooner and less traumatically rather than change later and more traumatically.
That's very interesting indeed. And now I have to ask, so what is the whole goal of sustainability marketing? What will put your heart at rest, and what will save the world, more to say? Is it phasing out conventional marketing completely, or we are seeking to achieve maybe an equal platform?
I think it is very much the ambition of superseding conventional marketing. This idea that conventional modern marketing management that became very strong in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, in the 90s began to maybe have its limitations exposed a bit more. And by the last decade, people really started to say, well, is this the right way to approach marketing? I think my hope would be that sustainability marketing really escapes from the situation it's been in over the last few years of often being sort of trapped in market niches. That part of the market rather for houses or for food or for transport embraces sustainability. So it's some consumers, some companies, some products. I think really if our ambition is to create a more sustainable economy and society, then we really need to get the mass markets involved so that it's the mass of consumers start to embrace more sustainable lifestyles and consumption. The mainstream of companies have to respond to that and start to provide solutions for them, so that really sustainability marketing becomes the new mainstream. So I think yes, maybe it's a very ambitious ambition, as it were, but it would be nice very much, I think, if sustainability marketing does become the conventional marketing of the 21st century. I think if it does, then our chances of creating a more socially equitable and environmentally sustainable society, as we move towards the next century after that, become greatly improved.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. But before I close the session, I have one burning question. Do you foresee an increased importance being placed on sustainability marketing?
I feel it has to come sooner or later. Yeah. I think all sorts of things, whether it's environmental resource shortages, starting to force companies to think in more environmentally and resource efficient terms. I think most of the issues on the sustainability agenda, sadly, they're going to get worse rather than getting better. I think that will lead to sort of media outcry, which will lead to public concern, which will get politicians interested. So I think it's kind of inescapable. I think these issues aren't going to go away. And at the moment, I think there's in the wake of the financial crunch of 2008 and afterwards, I think in a lot of regions like America and Europe, there is a kind of moment of reconsideration about the way in which businesses operate, the degree in which companies are socially responsible, the degree to which our old way of doing things was sustainable. So I think there is sort of a moment of reflection about maybe, well, what do we want out of our economies, our societies, our businesses? Can we find new ways of going forward that maybe does deliver less economic growth in the old-fashioned sense, but more of a sense of prosperity, more sustainable livelihoods, more really rewarding ways of living and consuming and working than we had before. So I think it's a very good, it's a good moment in a sense to be reconsidering the way we do things in all aspects of society, including marketing, which does have a very influential role to play across all sorts of bits of society, not just in the world of commerce, but increasingly, whether we're talking about education or politics or healthcare or a whole range of things, marketing is increasingly influential. So I think if we can make that transformation towards a more sustainability-orientated approach to marketing, that marketing as a discipline can really start to play a fuller role in that move towards what we would hope is a more sustainable future society.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Ken P.T. This has been very interesting, very informative, and quite comprehensive as well. And I hope I speak on behalf of all you students. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you now understand the whole concept of sustainability marketing. Thanks again for joining us, and bye.